Hey, I'm Sven Genser, Master Student of Information Systems at the University of Münster. In this series on effective studying, I will equip you with all the information you need to make your studying more effective and fun. This video will introduce the practical topics retrieval, spacing, and enhancing common study strategies. When we think of testing, many of us probably think of a setting like you see on the graphic. A bit exaggerated, I agree, but the point is we think of testing as a dry, standardized activity imposed on us by someone else to measure how much we learned. This generally invokes a negative sentiment in us, especially when the stakes are high. The book Make It Stick compares this to a dipstick. Like someone is putting a dipstick in your brain, pulling it out, and then assessing how much we learned. If this is the only way you are thinking about testing, let me invite you to undertake a paradigm shift with me. Tests can not only be used to measure learning, but are also a helpful tool for improving learning. This is the result of more than a century of research. To quote Thorndike from his book The Principles of Teaching of the year 1906, the active recall of a fact from within is, as a rule, better than its impression from without. And this is the simple idea behind retrieval. We recall already learned material from memory. While already learned implies that the learning material has already been presented to you, for example when attending a lecture or reading a book. Related terms describing the same concept are active recall and practice testing. And if we initiate the testing ourselves, it is called self-testing, which we will probably spend most of our time on. Although some textbooks and some lecturers do provide explicit retrieval questions, which are a great learning opportunity for us. There are only a few things to consider. First, it is important to check our answers, even if we are confident. This way we combat the illusion of knowing. Furthermore, it is important to really answer the question yourself before reviewing the solution. This may sound obvious, as you are otherwise not even practicing retrieval, but sometimes it is tempting to quickly review the answer and then telling yourself, yeah, I knew that, next question. Especially when you feel that you don't have much time. I have certainly experienced this temptation. Try to avoid it as best as you can by taking your time to answer the question by recalling the information from memory. Second, even when you have failed in recalling the information, restudying the material after failed retrieval is still more effective than not attempting the retrieval at all. The reasoning behind that is by trying to retrieve the information, you put your brain in a state where it can absorb the restudied information better, as you already paved part of the way for storing it. Third, in general, if the knowledge is more difficult to retrieve, retrieval has a greater benefit. This implied that retrieval is most effective with spacing, the next study strategy we will look at in this video. The advantages of retrieval are that it strengthens the memory and that it shows us gaps in our knowledge, as it becomes obvious that we didn't know something when we can't answer a question, thus combating the illusion of knowing. These advantages are so well established and studied widely that Make It Stick suggests that retrieval should be our primary study strategy. Luckily, it also works well with most of the other study strategies we will cover in this video series. Retrieval can be implemented in various forms. First, we can use flashcards. We can either use the good old physical version or go digital, for example with Anki, which is the most widely spread application, but others exist as well. Second, we can also write down questions and answers, which is essentially the same thing. Here you can go physical too, or use applications like Notion or Obsidian. A relatively new app combining notes and flashcards is RemNote. Overall, there is a plethora of apps. I would advise you to not spend too much time trying to find the optimal software, as probably most of them work very fine. Just go with what feels right, and if it is missing a crucial feature, it is always possible to change later. My implementation has changed slightly over the course of the last years. In my bachelor studies, I used Notion to implement the questions and answers method. I always highlight the most important words of my questions so that I can get the gist of it even quicker. In general, I'm a huge fan of colors, as you will also see later. In the second semester, I did something I would never do anymore, which is that I grouped the questions by the lecture the content was covered. And this is not by accident, but because I genuinely thought it makes sense. This was especially nonsense, as the professor stopped his lecture after 90 minutes, sometimes in the middle of a topic. You can see it, for example, in 4 merge sort and 5 analysis of merge sort. In this specific case, it is not too bad, because the lectures are only divided by a toggle. But in general, you would rather organize your questions by the topic they deal with instead of the lecture. You could also argue that you can find the questions more easily, but as I work completely digital with Ctrl F, this is irrelevant. In the following semesters, you see that the divisions of the document made more sense, for example for mutual exclusion. Further, I used callouts for important information which I wanted to revise but not test me upon. Now, in my master studies, I am using Obsidian, but I stick with the questions and answers. Here I write plain markdown documents with embedded LaTeX code for formulas. I further like Obsidian for its clean design, fast performance and customizability. A hint that can be valuable to beginners. Always be aware of the context in which the question assumes while you write it. The context includes the file the question is part of and the headings, subheadings, or previous questions. It can be the case that in answering the question, you are missing some of that context, like a lecture slide you have opened while writing the question. So, phrase the questions in a way that your future self knows what you are asking for. This is also one reason why I personally prefer questions and answers over flashcards. Questions and answers give you more context around your questions, which is harder to implement with flashcards, as the order of the cards may change. But it also has its disadvantages, like that implementing variation is more difficult. More on that topic in the next session. Also, spacing, more on that in just a second, needs to be implemented by hand, while it is already implemented in apps like, say, Anki. Very recently I have started trying out RemNote to learn a bit of Spanish. Using the app feels like a mixture of using Obsidian and Notion. It shines in its ease of use when creating flashcards of different kinds, like question-answer on the left or close on the top right, as they are automatically generated when formatting the document in a certain way. To my mind, this is a great way of combining flashcards and note-taking, reaping the benefits of spacing while still giving you the option to structure the flashcards in a document, giving it context. Still, bear in mind that some of the features are reserved for pro users. Now some questions for you. In which form are you already using Retrieval? Which of your current courses might benefit most from implementing Retrieval? And how exactly do you want to implement Retrieval into your study routine? Let's go on to the next topic. Just like Retrieval, spacing describes a very simple concept, that we should let time pass between our study sessions. This leads to us forgetting part of what we already have learned, which is a desirable difficulty. I hope you can still recall the forgetting curve. Apart from interrupting the forgetting, as a long-term benefit, this way our learned knowledge has time to consolidate into a cohesive representation in the brain. Anything we want to remember must be recalled from memory periodically, which is also why we need to reach back to retrieve prior material. This way we can also find new insights of how our knowledge learned at different points in time relates to each other. If you think about it, spacing is omnipresent in our everyday life. We exercise throughout the whole year, a few times every week, instead of every day a few days or weeks before a competition or before summer. We learn an instrument in the same way, by practicing relentlessly over the course of years. The same holds for language learning and even building strong relationships with friends. Also, improving our life through many short sessions is at the heart of what habits are. So here's my advice. Use the powerful strategy, spacing, which you are already applying in many different forms, also for learning new concepts in your studies. As you probably know, or have guessed by now, the choice between retrieval and spacing is not an exclusive or. On the contrary, both strategies harmonize together wonderfully. By using spacing, you make the retrieval more difficult and thus more effective. And by using retrieval in your spaced out sessions, you make every minute that you are learning count. When you plan to implement spacing, one of the first questions that you will encounter is how long should I wait before revisiting the material? It depends on the study material. While I cannot give you concrete numbers, I can give you some general guidelines which you can use to determine the schedule best suitable for your needs and your time schedule. First, make the time interval large enough so that the practice does not become mindless repetition. That is, that you have already forgotten part of it which you need to recall. On the other hand, don't make the interval too large, so you would need to relearn the material. Second, when your confidence in the material grows, so should the length of the interval. Nevertheless, don't drop important information completely. Further, Karpicke and Bauernschmidt found that, quote, repeated spaced retrieval had powerful effects on retention, but the relative schedule of repeated tests had no discernible impact. And it is well known that increasing the absolute spacing between repetitions improves retention, especially in the long term. That means for us, when our exam is in 10 weeks and we want to revise the material 5 times, it is best the earlier we start. But how exactly we space out the material in the 10 weeks is not of so much importance, as long as we follow the advice that I mentioned earlier. Later, I will tell you what worked well for me. There are systems which can help you to implement spacing. When you are using physical flashcards, you can implement spacing manually by using, for example, the Leitner system. Here your flashcards move to the next box when you record the information correctly and to the previous box if not. The earlier boxes are revised more frequently, the later ones less frequent. For digital flashcards, the algorithms are already implemented, like the free-spaced repetition scheduler, and you can tune them according to your preferences. If you want to take the spacing into your own hands, you can also have multiple options. You can create a normal revision calendar where you plan for every topic when you want to revisit it again, based on a reasonable interval you determined in advance. Another option, which I learned about in a video by Ali Abdal, is the retrospective revision timetable. Here you don't plan in advance when you will revisit a topic, but based on your latest performance. If the topic went well, you schedule the next session later. If not, you schedule it earlier. This way you incorporate that you should revise more often the topics which trouble you more. You can use, for example, an Excel document to keep track of your revision dates and use color coding for getting a better overview. For me personally, as I have mostly learned with questions and answers, I've used fixed times on which to revise. The first time is the same or following day of hearing the lecture. The second time on Saturday, which I call the weekly revision, where I revised all the new material of the week, and for which I sometimes could even convince some of my fellow students to join me. The third time is in the Christmas or Pentecost holidays, where I reviewed all the material covered until then, and then 2 or 3 times in the weeks prior to the exam. This is probably not the perfect method, but as we have already seen before, It is way more important to have a long absolute interval, while the relative intervals are less important. So my questions for you: how exactly do you want to implement spacing into your study routine? Also consider what works best with your retrieval strategy. When do you want to start studying for the next examination phase? And apply spacing by reviewing this material of the video in the next days. Rereading, marking, note-taking and outlining are all techniques which are widely used by us students, but sadly in a way making them quite ineffective compared to other strategies like spacing and retrieval. The paper 5 Popular Study Strategies, Their Pitfalls and Optimal Implementations from 2018 takes a different approach than most other research areas. Instead of trying to find more effective strategies, they investigate on how to improve the learning strategies which are already widespread. The motivation of this approach is our tendency to resist new strategies and prefer the ones we already know. The intuition behind rereading is that we have the benefit of repetition. And if we don't remember something after we encountered it the first time, then it will help us when we read it again. It further has the benefit of requiring comparatively little effort. By now, you probably know that rereading by itself is an ineffective learning strategy, as you, the learner, are passive, which means that no effortful processing is required, and it further supports the fluency illusion, which states that we confuse the fluency in reading the text with an actual understanding of it. Thus, when you want to study effectively, you should not do massed rereading, and especially not for gaining a deep understanding of the topics. If you don't want to give up on rereading, you should combine it with spacing and retrieval, which means that first, that you let time pass between rereading sessions, and second, that you test yourself on the content before you are rereading it. While marking, which comprises underlining as well as highlighting, as both serve the same purpose, is not the most effective strategy, it has some positive effects. It is very simple to use. If you already spent the time on reading a text or listening to a lecture, you can as well use it to select the information so that it is more easily identified later. Studies have also found that the marked information is recalled better. When you want your marking to be effective, you should not mark too little or too much, and not reread the marked passages. Nevertheless, the paper stated that an effective marking strategy can be learned in as little as 60 minutes. Further, they argue that you should not mark after the first reading, but to use that to identify key points to be marked and then mark in the second reading. I personally use highlighting quite excessively, sometimes on the verge of too much, I suppose. My reasoning is that I sit in the lecture anyways, and it doesn't require additional time, and it keeps me engaged. Over the years, I have developed a color scheme, which I use for all lectures, papers and books I read on my tablet, for highlighting as well as the notes I take myself. It is a hierarchical highlighting approach, which allows me to quickly identify the structure of a text. What are the important concepts and their definitions? What are the pros and cons, etc. Your specific needs and colors probably differ from mine, but I highly recommend you to establish a color scheme yourself that you can use for all lectures. Also, highlighting is not the way I truly learn, rather a pre-processing step to make further processing in terms of retrieval and note-taking easier. A general finding regarding note-taking is that handwritten notes are more effective than typed ones. There are at least two reasons for this. First, most of us can type very quickly, which can tempt us to take verbatim notes. This leads to shallow processing of the material, which can harm our learning, as it takes time away which we could spend on deeper processing. Also in the current times, where we get the slides and sometimes even a script for the lecture, this kind of note-taking became obsolete. And second, the more sophisticated movements of your hand when writing by hand instead of typing helps you to remember the information better. Note-taking is good when it is done in form of a generative process, which means summarizing, paraphrasing, organizing, and outlining. The identifying feature of efficient notes is to concisely express critical ideas in as few words as possible. Here, less is often more, as using less words correspond to a higher degree of compression. Lastly, it is also important to review the notes, probably even more important than creating them in the first place. Now, on the topic of outlining, which is a specific form of note-taking, creating hierarchical representation of the main points. It requires the learner to identify, relate, and organize the main points. It is effective when used as a cue for retrieval. Further, we profit from an outline given by the lecture beforehand, which is the responsibility of the lecturer. And if we are lucky to have it, we should try to comprehend it and use it to mentally organize the things we learn. Nevertheless, as I will elaborate on it in the next video, an outline provided by the teacher is not to be taken as the incontestable truth, but rather as a suggestion from which we can deviate. I also use some kind of outlining in my study practice, which I will show when we cover the topic on mental models in the next video. We have seen that there are effective ways to augment our existing study strategies, which are retrieval, spacing, and instructor assistance. A general takeaway is that the learning strategies are not an either-or decision, but rather a toolbox from which you can pick the one that fits best for a given occasion, and which you can combine to be even more powerful. As the paper also states, new behaviors are attained most efficiently when they are incorporated into pre-existing behaviors. So, we should acknowledge that implementing completely new methods requires effort and take small steps at a time. So my question to you is, which of your study strategies do you want to make more effective and how? Let's summarize what we have seen in this video. First, we should use retrieval, which is recalling already learned material from memory, as our main study strategy whenever possible. We should implement spacing by spreading out our study sessions as much as possible. Effective study strategies are versatile tools that we can select and combine according to our needs and preferences. Even less effective study strategies can become more effective when applied properly and combined with retrieval and spacing. That's it for this video. I hope you've learned something new, or at least found the motivation to implement what you've learned. And I hope to see you again in the next video when we will cover more of the effective study strategies. Until then, happy learning!